Good morning, everybody. Can we get just a sound from folks that they can hear me? And apologies for the late start. Just wanted to welcome everybody to the webinar this morning, to the DEC membership webinar where we have an invited guest, Mr. Timothy Roberts. My name is Bertha French, and I am one of the founders of the Descendants of Enslaved Communities of Virginia. And I am very pleased to serve currently as the Vice President and host of this webinar. Today we have Mr. Roberts, who is the founder of Black Star Cultural Resources. He recently stepped down as the Virginia Department of Historic Resources African American Community Outreach Coordinator, and he specializes in historical and archaeological investigations, analysis, and interpretation for mobilizing historic cultural resources as assets for community-driven preservation and informed change. Welcome, Mr. Roberts. You have the floor.
Thank you, Bertha. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to the descendants of enslaved communities at the University of Virginia. This is a very gracious opportunity. I'm very excited to share with you some of the details of my recent work on this Saturday morning. I'll be talking about my recent engagements with descendant communities in two neighborhoods, one in the city of Richmond and one in the city of Danville, which may be the next Richmond. I don't know. See if I get the slides to work. So I'm going to spend some time discussing some of my work in the communities in the Westwood neighborhood, which is in Richmond, Virginia's West End, and Elme Grove on the south side of Danville. I thought I'd have the capacity to pull some content together about Frederick Douglass Court in Richmond on the north side. That was the first African American streetcar suburb. Maybe we'll get to it later in the discussion if we have any discussion. I was also hoping to be able to talk about the Bandy Lane community, which was formerly located in Richmond's West End until it was demolished in 1955. I've been spreading myself pretty thin. As Bertha said, I founded Black Star Cultural Resources last summer, and I've been in the school of hard knocks on how to run a business. So, but anyway, before last summer, as was mentioned, I was working with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources as the agency's first African American community outreach coordinator. The role is now filled by Latoya Gray Sparks, who's heard about my dream to decipher and leak the Urban Renewal playbook, hence the reason for my ambitious title. Not there yet, but on the way. Before I was in the coordinator position, before the coordinator position was created, I had spent 2 years as an archaeological reviewer in the review and compliance division at the agency. And that division is responsible for assisting federal projects in compliance with the stipulations of the National Historic Preservation Act, especially consultation under Section 106. And in a nutshell, that federal law, requires that federal agencies consider the potential impacts of their undertaking. So that's any project essentially involving federal funds or federal permits or on federal property for that matter. They have to consider these undertakings and their potential impacts on significant historic properties, which specifically means those that are listed in the National Register of Historic Places or eligible for listing in the National Register. From my experience in that position, I'll end my presentation this morning with a couple of recommendations, a couple of possible policy changes that I believe could motivate broader institutional and structural change in our society, informed by the history of race relations in America. So after I get done running off the mouth, hopefully we should have some time to build together through discussion, or perhaps folks might submit questions to DEC that we can follow up with later. But I'd definitely like to talk to folks about some of the things I'm going to be discussing today. I read my horoscope, especially when I'm nervous. And so I hope you won't mind if I share today's with you. It's a Leo. It says, no one remembers what happened when everyone played it cool. Life should be memorable. Push yourself to love bigger. When you feel the impulse to be enthusiastic, reveal your heart or be more generous than the situation calls for. Do it. Okay, so in the words of the 25th Infantry of the Buffalo Soldiers in the Spanish American War, onward. This graph you're seeing here is basically showing the essentially ultimate increase in house prices between 1974 and 2024 in Virginia. So this is the 50-year span since the formal end of federal urban renewal programs, capital U, capital R. It was not just an era. These were a particular, essentially legislated distribution of funds for specific projects to states and municipalities for various initiatives. You might even say different kinds of agendas. So, what we can see here, of course, but, as we'll dig into, and I'm sure a lot of folks out there who are working in descendant communities are probably also seeing that there are severe impacts to the affordability of generationally owned properties. They're looming over descendants of founding families in these communities and neighborhoods. And in my view, the situation is being driven by strategies for growth at work in, we're considering Richmond and Danville, these two rapidly growing cities, in ways that seem to pick up where urban renewal left off 50 years ago. Born out in my experience with Westwood and Richmond's West End, advocacy emphasizing the historical and living significance of our cultural patrimony, in concert, especially with vocalizing the perpetual record of urban renewal era responses and results and abuses, can be important tools in public consultations where history is not legislation. And I'll say, in fact, my engagement with the Westwood community and Almagro was really the final push for me to resign from DHR and to start Black Star. My involvement with Westwood began with a phone call from a Westwood descendant, Norwood Thornton. Mr. Norwood Thornton, his phone call was notifying me that I'd been copied on an email just sent to the city of Richmond, sent on the behalf of the Westwood Civic Association, requesting that the city consult with me in my capacity as DHR's outreach coordinator. And he kind of got my title wrong here, but that was also part of the motivation to, recognizing that there are real needs in the communities that I've been working with that are just, they're outside of the state's jurisdiction, but not out of my capacity to lend assistance. In this particular case, the Westwood community was opposing a special use permit application to subdivide a parcel at 910 Parish Street for building two-story houses. This is private property, it's a city permit, it's totally out of state jurisdiction, and it probably would have been inappropriate at best for me to reach out myself, but I would have been happy to provide technical assistance to the city in my official role, as I had done so for other municipalities over the last several years, but I was not contacted. So the 910 Parish Street lot and 908 and a half Parish Street were purchased together for $250,000 from the city. It had been seized in a tax seizure, and apparently neither the listed property owner, who had actually passed in 2012, nor their family could be contacted. And you'll notice too, this is the notice. This is from the back of the Valentine's Day edition of the Richmond Free Press in I want to say this is 2018. And you'll notice too in the column on the right, it says it's ordered that Lurlian W. Taylor, upon information and belief deceased or his heirs. This is a woman, this is Mrs. Lurlian W. Taylor, who was preceded in death by her husband, as it says in her obituary. The purchaser wanted to construct two-story houses on the 910 lot, roughly identical to the one that had been quickly built on 908 and a half Parish Street. The woman who owns the 908 Parish Street, where the arrow is pointing home, is a descendant in her 70s, actually an elder member of Norwood's family, the man who had contacted me. She had no idea, they had no idea, that half of the property for which their family had cared for generations didn't belong to them and could be claimed from them without consultation and completely transformed. So this is the house that was built at 908 and a half. And the most recent assessment of this particular property is $469,000, which is about the same amount estimated for each of the two properties that they had planned to build on 910 Parish Street if they were able to obtain that special use permit. So let's do the numbers. The buyer and developer hoped the $250,000 investment in basically a single lot would result in a 1.3 or so million dollar windfall among 3 lots, which of course that's also going to generate some great, plenty of city property tax revenue. So intentional or not, would this sudden appreciation in value wreak havoc on the affordability of the modest houses that make up the neighborhood, even without speculating on the development potential of the land itself? So the property with the arrow that you saw with the arrow pointed at 908 and a half, 908 Parish Street. That property in its entirety is the most recent assessment is about $75,000. Spoiler alert, the image on the right is a photograph I took the day before yesterday. This is the dwelling that was built instead of the 2 towering townhomes after the applicant decided not to pursue the permit, which was after our effective comments at the City Planning Commission meeting last June 2023. So I joined Norwood and Reverend Jeanette Brown, pastor of Westwood Baptist Church, at the June meeting. And we had a 2-pronged approach, personal and technical. For months, property owners and descendants had been attending these meetings, delivering thoughtful and heartfelt personal statements and practical concerns like traffic safety, first responder access, parking, congestion, in addition to highlighting the history of the neighborhood. So as a private citizen, I joined them. I voiced comments, also opposed to granting the special use permit. And some of the things I pointed out were the inevitable impact of the construction on not only the historic integrity of the district, which has been recommended eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places by the State Review Board, but also the affordability of the neighborhood for current residents, many of whom are elderly and include direct descendants of the district's founding families, living on fixed incomes that would likely not accommodate a dramatic rise in annual property tax, which would have been inevitable with increases in assessed value of the land on which their parents or grandparents had literally built the homes in which they were living. We share the community's history as a foundation for demonstrating the established character of the people and the place, and the sustainability, you could say resistance, which is just manifest in their continued existence, perpetuation, and hopeful future. I cited Richmond's South Side property values, which had increased by more than 100% in some places between 2021 and 2022. The land value, okay, the land value increased by 100%, not the value of the improvements, which means the houses themselves. And I don't know what role the speculation spurred by the proposed plans for the casino played in the South Side rise, even though it failed the vote. So a new annual expense of double the previous year is making houses unaffordable for families who have perhaps built them and have owned them free and clear for generations. And remember, this is going on during the pandemic, with all the disruptions it brought to stable employment and public assistance. Some of the other points that I raised that I think really helped our cause, and I have some of them enumerated here on this slide. It was important to call out some of the misinformation or misleading information that was being presented to the commission. For example, statements like this design is in keeping with the character and historical trajectory of development in the neighborhood, which it was not. And it was also important to question canned language and phrases that you hear a lot, like by right or grandfathered in, or the other houses, the historic houses that is, do not meet the current code, which honestly, that would really be a more appropriate way to talk about being grandfathered in. Together, these kinds of claims, they're contradictory, ahistorical, that deny the context and the historical development of the neighborhood. It's like an attempt to outlaw the essence of the architectural character itself. It was really important to provide these evidence-based forecasts about the likely impacts to affordability to current property owners, which we did by drawing examples from the South Side where this is currently going on. And it was also important to unpack how the proposed development ran counter despite the statements that were made even by city staff at the meeting, to uh, city-sponsored and authored guidance documents like the Richmond 300 Master Plan. These kinds of documents are created for this purpose. They're for guidance, but they're not laws. And especially, it was really important, and I'm so grateful for this, to address the City Planning Commission, especially in a public and recorded forum. There's actually a recording of this meeting out there that I haven't had the nerve to re-listen to. But public bodies like city and county planning commissions are the brains of the local legislative process, and they need us, members of the public, to come forward and express concerns and share information. Otherwise, that side of the aisle is essentially silent. Um, One of the other possible tools for the kit that I talked about with Westwood community members was possibly doing interior 360 photo tours, like you see on Google Earth, of people's inhabited homes. And I had similar discussions with community members in Almagro, which I'll move on to. And the motivation for this, the idea behind it is, if you think back, if you will, to urban renewal, blight and slum, these were effectively used as subjective terms. And I've seen from several other projects that, maybe we'll discuss at another time, how easy it is to sort of convince people, sight unseen, that this area, has low property values. It's occupied by a predominantly Black population, historically occupied by a Black population. It's almost on the tip of people's tongues or on the tip of their mind. And this is a legacy of urban renewal, I would argue. So, I thought this might be a useful tool. We didn't do it. And as you saw from the last example, we were able to make an impact, at least in the consultation process, by showing up. My conversations with the Almagro Resource Center began focused on the 1943 Winslow Community Hospital building. So this is in Southwest Virginia, the gateway to the Southwest. It's the last capital of the Confederacy. And so this is on the south side, literally on the south side of the railroad tracks from the rest of the city. Carice Luck-Bremer had actually given my name to the Almagro Resource Center, and so they reached out to me. She put us in touch, and the community was concerned about possible demolition and redevelopment of the property because it had recently been purchased by the Danville Redevelopment and Housing Authority, although no plans for the property for how it might be used were shared at the time. I thought we were focusing on the hospital, but things became more complicated with community concerns about a draft city master plan that brought Almagro into the same district as downtown and included recommendations for rezoning and a lot of new construction. As it turns out, a new draft was actually released earlier this week, which I learned about last night. And I haven't read it, but I did recognize this image from the earlier plan and also noted some updates. So you can see in the blue circle in the culture section, the plans for Winslow Hospital are more specific, more explicit. Shiloh Baptist Church, which was possibly built around 1885, and Almagro School. And if you're looking at that hashed blue shape, it's the building on the left-hand side of that kind of sticks out on the opposite side of the L. And so the school was built sometime before 1915. Incredible building, beautiful building from the outside. And so these are included as part of a cultural incubator. Item number 3 under housing is also a new addition. The housing recommendations were not subdivided in the previous plan. And you'll see this one says potential for a housing land trust if there was sufficient organization and capacity in the future, which sounds promising. I would very much appreciate anything anyone has to say about cultural incubators and housing land trusts. A lot of this is really new to me outside of my wheelhouse as a historian. And this is all happening, in the moment. So the upside down map, I did find confusing, but we adjust our view. So it's returning to kind of my earlier engagement then, going back to the last year when I started working with Almagro. Things really became complicated when several properties in the neighborhood appeared on the list of those to be offered for sale at public auction. Kind of up in the air I recommended that the ARC submit a preliminary information form to start the process of nominating the neighborhood, Almagro Historic District, to the National Register of Historic Places. And in fact, the district was brought before the State Review Board at the same time as Winslow Hospital, and also, for that matter, as Frederick Douglass Court, which I mentioned earlier. And the board supported all three of those recommendations for eligibility just last month. So, back in January, on the ground, we started with taxes. Right? We're looking forward to producing the preliminary information form, but the tax sales were an immediate concern. We were able to inform one of the heirs of the property about the unpaid bill, and I'm only showing one of several. I'm showing a 5-acre lot that's wooded and would appear vacant, essentially. Seeing it here from the air. So we were able to inform her and about the unpaid bill. It was extremely low, and the president of the Almagro Resource Center actually delivered the money just before the auction. The woman that we spoke with is a septuagenarian. She's in her 70s. She's still managing the business her family's operated for decades. Their office is literally around the corner, essentially across the street from City Hall, the tax collector's office, and the courthouse, et cetera. It's the Civic Center. And their business is a bonds office. So they're providing a service directly related to the goings on across the street. She had no idea that the property belonged to her family. And when I showed her photographs that I had taken and the maps, when she saw this, and she said, "That's our road." And it actually just so happened that many of her family members were actually coming into town the next week. So, either better late than never or divine timing. It's still bizarre to me how quickly the bureaucracy breaks down when it comes to property seizures for taxes. The delinquent tax burdens for these properties that were slated for the auction block in Almagro were incredibly low. Incredibly low. I was conducting field work for the preliminary information form and was invited by ARC to join them for a Plan Danville meeting, which is the kind of outreach consultation that the city is conducting for the new master plan. And one of the questions I asked in our small group when it was mentioned that the housing plans were intended to be affordable, I asked what, we're at the conceptual stage at that point, what a ballpark figure for affordability might look like. And the representative responded, somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000, which, maybe in Richmond, this is getting close to what we would call affordable on kind of a sliding scale. But one of the residents and property owners in Almagro commented that none of the properties in Almagro are assessed at any greater than $60,000, and most are much, much lower. Properties with houses on them, occupied homes. The reality was that the bills went unpaid because they were never received. The notices were never received. They were sent to places where people used to live or places where there was no house or an office, let alone a mailbox. Like, these were essentially sent as though they were letters to the dead, and they were not letters to the dead. In my view, urban renewal historically is emerging as a playbook with no rules, just tradition. Today, we're facing similar problems. We're using similar approaches. It seems that we should be expecting similar outcomes. The same families on the defense or on the run or literally left in the dust. The housing crisis of today is real, and it seems that nothing like it has been seen since the 1950s. But I would wager that today's housing crisis is one of affordability, not population booms, not migration or immigration, not soldiers returning from overseas, not women entering and staying in the workforce. It couldn't possibly be from increased incomes or buying power. So I do wonder whether the next crisis in the next 50 years will be a great migration inland from the coast. I think I've talked to folks about this. I've shared this a lot. I think that to a great extent, culture is sort of a series of questions and answers, not to boil it down, but to a great extent. And new questions can lead to culture change. And likewise, new answers to old questions is a path forward to culture change. Some of the takeaways that I gained from this experience, are that individuals are empowered by right to effect change, or at least try, with words in the public forum. And that history is a strong foundation for an argument, especially if you bring that history up to the present, and even more powerfully and more especially if you start in the present. Urban renewal is becoming a recognized period of historic significance. We're 50 years since. This is the sort of federal cutoff date for the when something is considered historic, once it's 50 years old. But the people who lived this history, 1942 to 1974, are here. Not even just our elders, depending on, I guess, how old you are. This history is alive. It's in living color. It's in surround sound. We've seen it then, and we're seeing it now. I'm a verbal processor, and I believe that direct reference to racism and enslavement in written policy is another step towards taking reparations seriously, a step beyond taking reparations seriously. It's one of the reasons I as a cold researcher, appreciate the language from the 1940s and the 1950s newspapers, reading these for research through, say, Virginia Chronicle. It is the blatant racist language, the statements that the motivation for demolishing a neighborhood, for example, is to remove a particular population, to remove a demographic and make it available for someone else. In Westwood, where the city of Richmond annexed that part of Henrico County in 1942, the city essentially immediately condemned the private wells and privies that were being used by the residents, and saying that they were condemned and the area needed to be demolished. The plan was to add it to a 137-acre green space, and create a park from this former village in what was then a rural part of the county. And property owners, white property owners, many of whom were employing the folks that were living in Westwood, came and spoke up at these commission meetings, and they were able to fight these down. But interestingly, the city had to follow through with the statements about the unsanitary conditions, classic urban renewal justification. And so did follow through with condemning the wells, and they established a single water pump for everyone in the community to use for a course of 2 years at the farthest possible point from Westwood Baptist Church, which is the heart of the community. They did receive city services in 1947. So I'd like to offer a couple of recommendations based on my experience as a project review archaeologist, and working with the state historic preservation office, DHR, in the context of section 106, these federal consultations where you have undertakings that are sometimes demolitions, acquisitions, new construction, falling under the stipulations of the National Historic Preservation Act. And a phrase that we would hear a lot and even say a lot is the spirit of the law. Even though the guiding regulations for this National Historic Preservation Act are written out, they're essentially recommendations. It's guidance. And the spirit of the law kind of becomes top of mind, I think, especially when you're talking about, at least now, more recent historic properties. And in reflecting on it, the spirit of the law, it's especially heard when there's no clear metric for success, or there's a lack of capacity or a mechanism for enforcing these stipulations or recommendations. And to be clear, the State Historic Preservation Office in this process makes recommendations to the federal agency. There's no enforcement capabilities. There's no capacity for it, for that matter. Um, I really think that the spirit of Section 106 should be incorporated into regulatory planning and consultation for processes that are outside of, or I guess say below or nested underneath these federal undertakings, at the city level, at the state level, especially when there's the potential to impact historically disenfranchised populations. The spirit out loud. In my opinion, direct reference again to racism and enslavement and written policy is another step beyond taking reparations seriously. So my recommendations are for the Virginia Department of Historic Resources to add urban renewal, capital U, capital R, as a formal historic context and period of significance recognized by the Commonwealth of Virginia and the state's guidelines for conducting historic resources survey in Virginia. This period kind of overlaps, of course, what we often refer to as the civil rights era. And the distinction I would like to make, at least in my mind, is that the civil rights era is not bookended. The civil rights era began, and we're still in it. Urban renewal, however, technically speaking, began and then it ended. And the 1940s to 1974. And the responses to the impacts of urban renewal decisions also fueled many actions on behalf of civil rights organizations like the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, that established a headquarters in Almagro in the summer of 1963 after the events of Bloody Monday. Police brutality rained down upon peaceful protesters. In fact, among the things that the protesters were standing up for was the lack of municipal support for Winslow Hospital that had been built in 1943. And, maybe apropos, many of the people injured during that brutality were taken to Winslow Hospital, which is outlined and specifically laid out with names in SNCC's pamphlet, which they produced, Danville, Virginia, and you can find the stuff online. I encourage you to look for it. Historic racism against African Americans should be highlighted as a central theme in this period of significance of urban renewal, with explicit precedence in the period of de jure enslavement and continued implementation, and continued during the implementation of urban renewal projects beyond the 1974 end of federal funding for those programs. At the federal level, I would recommend amending Title 36 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 800, which is the guiding regulation, it's the implementation language for Section 106. I would like to see added direct reference to historical racism against African Americans and guidance for identifying the potential for any federal undertaking to exacerbate and make worse materially racial disenfranchisement, and B, ways that the undertaking may contribute to repairing systems for broad access to diverse services for diverse populations. And this means developing structural models for recognizing material social constructions of historic racial disenfranchisement in the landscape, in the built environment, in the material world, and in contexts that are relevant to stakeholders. So I know it's a lot of technical language right there at the end, but I do think that having these in written formal historical guidance and legislation are the kinds of things that's going to really draw attention, maybe to help us also move forward with it with a shared understanding, and perhaps it's shame that we should be sharing rather than guilt. And here's a picture, in fact, of I think 1940 of the Almagro School. I've colorized it and turned it into this GIF. This is something I really like to do, and I wanted to include more of these in this presentation because it really brings to life these black and white photos. And besides just being kind of immersive, as you're staring at it and seeing these colors and recognizing this sort of thing, it also becomes a tool for analysis. You know, I see things in this picture once it presents itself in color that aren't clear to me in the black and white photo. The shadows start coming out. The different materials start, coming to the front. For example, on the porch, broken windows and that sort of thing. So, I think that we have some of these tools at our disposal as researchers to kind of make this more alive and bring it more into the present, so that there's not this sense of its detachment, that makes it easier to say, well, this has already happened. We're just moving forward into a brighter, better future. Okay, well, yeah, thank you so much for listening and joining on this Saturday morning. I'd love to hear from you, and look forward to any discussions about similar experiences. Whether you think that these tools may be useful in your situations, if you've also used these kinds of techniques, this kind of language to get through to your representatives and your elected officials to make more informed choices, more informed decisions with our voices heard and represented at the forefront.
Thank you so much, Tim, for a really comprehensive overview of your work and sharing of tools. I just have to say, of course, we just at our symposium, we were saddened that you weren't able to make it, but this you've made up for it. And this presentation has just been phenomenal. And I just wonder, we have to also apologize for some of the technical issues that we've been having, but I believe folks can, if they're able to, put questions in the chat. Is that correct, Naya?
Yes, you can post questions to the chat or you can use the Q&A feature. And we do have a question from Lynn Rainville that we can go ahead and answer if you'd like.
Okay,
I
let's,
see.
I don't,
Lynn types in the Q&A, and I'm happy to moderate the Q&A.
okay, but I
Um,
don't see them.
Tim, to your point about newspaper notifications and municipalities that fail miserably at contacting relevant property owners when their property is under discussion, do you have any recommendations for ways to improve that notification system when folks like yourself aren't around to assist? Great talk.
Yeah, really. Thanks, Lynn. That's a great question. Having folks, I guess, like myself around, are helpful. And there's a lot of helpers out there and folks that want to help. But the techniques that I use to find this information, to try to track down these folks, they're not out of this world. They're not technologically inaccessible. These kinds of things are public record, and that's what makes it so bizarre, that there seems to be this breakdown in communication with the cities and counties, what have you, the municipalities' own records. I think one potential could be, editorials in these newspapers drawing attention to this shortcoming or these errors, and also drawing people's attention to where they can find this information. When you find it, I mean, it's not just put black in the back. I mean, when you have to scour through these notices in the back, I mean, it does take, you sort of have to remember to do it. Other than that, I think just continually voicing this concern and how it's unacceptable in the public forums, with the entities that are responsible for this work. It's not on us to do this work per se. It shouldn't be, right? But it is on us to come forward and let it be known, that we're not doing this, we're not doing this job, and we're depending on you, our elected officials, the appointed bodies, to follow through and get through to us.
It's a very good point. I mean, we live in an age of distraction and in an economy of distraction, and it feels like in many ways it's getting worse. And I'm sure plenty of people have on this call examples of where family properties or ancestral homes have been affected by this
Mhm.
phenomenon. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and drawing attention to the ways in which we can wake up and pay closer to attention to this issue.
Hmm.
I don't
One of
see,
the
oh, go
Well,
ahead.
I'll just make one more statement on that too. You know, one of the main tools that I've been using are the parcel mappers, the web apps. You can find them through city and county websites. If you're in Richmond, if you search for Richmond Parcel Mapper, or if you're in Danville, you might want to put Danville, Virginia, so you don't end up in Kentucky. But you know, this is a tool for going and seeking out, seeing, is the property that you've understood to be your property truly your property? Is it subdivided? Is in fact what you've been using as a driveway, or, that's where you're playing horseshoes, or you've just been cutting the grass for the last 30 years. Is this actually not in your name? The issue of heirs property is profound in Danville. I mean, to the extent that going onto the parcel mapper and looking at, and this is an interactive map, and it's not, you don't have to enter in codes or anything like that. It's a map. You type in an address. Some of these you can actually search by property owner names, of course, if you know the parcel numbers. But you'll looking at the property owners, say in Danville, in Almagrove, the number of heirs in estates is remarkable, and it's extremely troubling. And I'm sure at the symposium, which I was also very disappointed to have not been able to attend, I'm sure that this was a big topic of discussion, because it's really a driving component of how easy it is. Something I wanted to point out when I was showing the slide that had the boundaries for the 5-acre parcel that was going up on the auction block, was, there are tax delinquent properties all over the place. And necessarily the decision by municipalities, or those who are owed those taxes, the decision on which properties to go after is strategic. It has to be. It's not first in, first out. So if you were to look at a larger map, which I didn't show, Almagrove, just south of the tracks, right, in Danville, just south of Almagrove is a community called Grove Park, which was built up in the 1950s and 60s, and it's predominantly white. There's like Shamrock Lane and I think like Confederate Avenue or something like that down there. And so this particular parcel that I was showing, that 5-acre parcel at the bottom of Almagrove, was a former road that clearly is intended to be reinvigorated and expanded to connect those two neighborhoods for circulation. So it was a strategic decision, right, by the city to select this particular property, not just because it was large. It certainly wasn't a windfall of tax dollars. I don't want to say the number, but it was low. It was astonishingly low. So that's kind of another aspect too. I mean, if you really want to be an investigator about it, look at it in context. Zoom out from the map. If you see these heirs properties and you're trying to maybe figure something out. If you have master plans with recommendations for redevelopment and growth, where do we see those, especially these roads going? I mean, roads, especially in the context of urban renewal, right, has a very haunting legacy. So the parcel mapper is an excellent tool, and it's the kind of thing where, I mean, you can take screenshots. It's public record. You can share this stuff with your friends and neighbors. I mean, if you're meeting at, if you're part of a civic association, maybe this is the kind of thing, you make sure that all of your members have access to, they know it's there. If you have a website, put a link up there. People can search for their own properties even by name. So yeah.
Tim, during your presentation, you mentioned the Section 106 process, and I wondered if, just for those who may have never encountered Section 106 or are not aware of Section 106, if you could give kind of like a brief spark notes of what Section 106 is and what kind of projects typically trigger the Section 106 process.
Sure. Yes. So it's a consultative process. That's how we always talk about it. It's a guidance for how to consult publicly to determine for the federal agency to determine if there are potentially significant historic properties within their project footprint. And those kinds of projects may be the expansion of a highway, a reservoir, if you have a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers permit that's necessary because of the Clean Water Act, you're working close to a navigable waterway or something like that. That's going to trigger the Section 106 process, and in that case, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers would be the lead federal agency. If you receive a federal grant, if you are, let's say you own a property in a historic district and it's contributing to the historic district, it's listed in the National Register as contributing, hey, you're eligible for the incentives that come along with that voluntary and honorary National Register status. You're also given the deference, even more so, as a property owner for someone who may be affected by an undertaking. So if you're a property owner, you're listed in the National Register, right? It's voluntary. You don't have to do anything special with your property. You don't have to preserve it. You can burn it to the ground if that's the direction that you want to go. It's an honorary designation. But if you're trying to do that with federal permits and with federal funding, straight out, because that means your project is federally funded and subject to Section 106 or the National Historic Preservation Act.
Thanks. We have a question in the Q&A from Latoya. Hi, Latoya. Latoya has been super active in the chat, so thank you so much for all of your questions and comments and additions to the conversation. Latoya says, Tim, thank you so much for your presentation. Thank you for mentioning the comprehensive plans. In your experience, do you find comprehensive plans to be helpful to the descendant communities you're engaging with or harmful? I ask because I have my own doubts and disappointments with the outcome of the Richmond 300 plan here in Richmond.
Mm-hmm. So something that I've experienced in working with descendant communities, especially in cities, is that people are overwhelmed. These families are overwhelmed by this kind of engagement. I mean, yeah, I didn't get to talk about Frederick Douglass Court or Bandy Lane, but if you were watching that video that I was showing, the Westwood Community Built on Faith and Resilience, which that was produced by Henrico County, not City of Richmond, produced by Henrico County in 2018. It's on YouTube. It's awesome. It's incredibly moving. To sort of break it down in a way, so we're really close to the University of Richmond, right? On Richmond's far west end. The Bandy Lane community that I didn't talk about was demolished in 1955. The cemetery that they established in the 1870s is still there. I'm the secretary for the Friends group, the Friends of Sons and Daughters of Ham Cemetery, that we acquired the property. Before I became involved, they cleared it of vegetation and we started interpretation. It's incredible. I mean, we're seeing like the historic, cultural, the paths through this unmarked cemetery start to reemerge. We don't have to make them up. We can walk in the footsteps of the ancestors who established it as they intended, literally. But so the University of Richmond, there's a cemetery there, a burying ground there. That's sort of the grandmother cemetery of these cemeteries on the West End. Folks who were living at Bandy Lane, right next to the University of Richmond, while enslaved, were burying people on what is now the campus. They continued burying people there even after enslavement, as well as establishing the cemetery at Bandy, the one that we're stewarding. But by the 1920s, so the community's still there, they're still using Bandy. University of Richmond is in full effect. Nobody's getting buried on campus there, legally anyway. And folks in that community are also using the Westwood Baptist Church Cemetery, which is now Quioccasin Baptist Church Cemetery behind the Walmart out here. It's closed in. It's a picturesque picture. But when I asked, so the president of our Friends group grew up at Bandy. She was there till she was about 9 or 11 years old, and she remembers it. And when I asked about possibly partnering with, say, Westwood Baptist Church for like a Juneteenth celebration, it was like, we've got enough to worry about in our own community right now. So I think my point is that with these comp plans, it would be so wonderful if this was unifying our communities because we're dealing with the same problems and the same approaches to the same problems and expecting the same outcomes. But I think that they can and do divide communities at times. I also saw it in Danville, where, you'll remember from that slide, there was a statement about the potential for historic land trusts and housing trusts if there was sufficient organization in the future to manage such a thing. Well, during the process of the Plan Danville consultation, there were several different, I don't want to say factions because they're overlapping as well, but several different groups that were formed to meet this need for organized consultation, with the city to actually, get stuff done, answer these questions. And, because of that, you kind of, you run into these counter approaches. Folks aren't necessarily interested in sharing a lot of information. So I do think there's the potential for an almost divide and conquer, whether that's a side effect or not. Something else I see as problematic in the development of these plans is it becomes sort of a quid pro quo. There's like a give and take. Last January when we were looking at I don't know actually if it was as far back as January, but the previous draft in Danville, compared to the more recent draft, now we see that Winslow Hospital is being dedicated in this plan as a cultural heritage space, as an, I'm assuming, interpretive center and museum. You've got this cultural incubator, whereas before there was a fear that, all right, here we go, urban renewal in the 21st century, it's multifamily, market rate housing is about to go up. But I wonder, what's the take then? What if this is a gift, this is the reparative act, what's the take? And the take, not to be misled by the subdividing, and full disclosure, I have not read this document through. I've not been in conversations about this newest draft. My work kind of sort of tapered after the preliminary information form. But when you look at what the plans are for infill housing, it's like, well, this is dedicated to infill housing now. And this is, when in the meeting that I was at, the plans for what that was going to look like, a cottage court style development of new construction. This was on the table. It wasn't as though a recognition of the cultural significance and profound history and preservation in the community was driving a whole reframing of how to approach the community as a space. It's still included in the downtown district. It's still looking at rezoning. It's still looking at, redevelopment. So, I think that's the danger as well, is, we're quick to jump for the carrot before we see the stick coming.
Tim, thank you. I have a question related to Section 106 as it happens kind of in rural areas. So you talked a lot about urban renewal and the urban pressures, redevelopment pressures, but I want to bring in the conversation about environmental justice. I've been consulting on a project in Pine Grove, which is in Cumberland County, Virginia, where a historic Black rural community, a farming community, and their associated cultural resources, so many churches, a Rosenwald school, et cetera, have been threatened by the construction of a mega landfill. And that mega landfill development project, because it received federal funding and because it impacts navigable waterways, triggered a Section 106 process. But the recent court decisions by the Supreme Court that kind of gutted the environmental justice protections, or the ways that environmental justice could trigger a Section 106 process, meant that that process has moved forward without the community's partnership, that the Section 106 consultation has not gone through with the Pine Grove community, yet the development has been allowed to move forward with the mega landfill. And so I wondered if you could speak a little bit about the ways that our kind of contemporary Supreme Court decisions are perhaps weakening what is already a weak system of cultural resource preservation with tools like Section 106, National Register nominations, historic districts.
Yeah. The Section 106 process is designed to push a project to completion, right? It's not designed to look for things that are going to stop it, and not designed to say explicitly look for things that are going to slow it down. As an archaeologist, this is something I have run into my entire career, whether consulting or working in the public sector for the National Park Service and with the state at DHR. Their recommendations, everybody's given recommendations, And the timeline is the only tool that anybody really even has. I mean, even outside of Section 106, you know, one of the things folks bring up a lot are, say, traffic concerns, right? And it's been said to me explicitly in meetings, you know, kind of sidebar, like, oh, you know, the traffic study is not going to do anything, you know, this, that. And it's almost like, say, it's kind of like 106. It's like, well, yeah, we're going to go through the process. But ultimately, you know, we still have this goal in mind, losing sight of the spirit of the law, which is to avoid or minimize potential impacts. You know, redesign, redesign the project. And that's kind of one of the frustrations as well. You know, as a historian and an archaeologist, I'm no expert engineer. Uh, I'm certainly not, you know, like well versed in potential environmental impacts. Although at Pine Grove, I think, you know, we could see these very quickly from, you know, even the layman's stance. So it's astonishing. You know, this is another sort of problem, I guess you could say, with the law, and this is a matter of efficiency. Citizens are by right afforded the opportunity to provide public comment on these projects, and I've seen the public comments for Pine Grove, and it's heart wrenching, it's gutting, and it's the same when you read the comments for Westwood, you know, and pretty much any project that's going to have one of these impacts, especially on a particular community, and particularly historic communities with a sense of place, you know, well established. Um, but even if you're a consulting party, so you own a property that's within this district, it's contributing to the National Register, you're a consulting party, you're not a signatory. You can make comments, but you don't have to sign the agreement for it to be executed. So I don't just mean to kind of bring up all the negatives and some of the ways that we're stymied by the process, but what I will say is that these rules apply at every level. You know, it's our government isn't necessarily functioning as a top-down checks and balances, even though we run things up to the Supreme Court. I mean, when it comes to this advocacy and engagement, you're better off with local support and support at every level, support from abroad. You know, having these letters of support, I think, can go a long way, especially if you can draw in experts that can provide strategies to minimize these impacts. Folks talk a lot about, well, we don't talk a lot, we've been talking about it more lately, mitigation. And mitigation is like the third step. So in the Section 106 process, like the goal is to identify potentially significant properties, the potential impacts of that undertaking, and avoid or minimize those impacts as it relates to, say, historic properties, for example. If that's not feasible, not as in we just don't want to take the time, but it's not feasible. This bridge has to be built because the other one's collapsing and it's going to go through, you know, a shipwreck. The project's going to happen. So what the responsibility then of the federal agency, in essence, and the project proponents, the ones that were actually, say, getting the money to do the work, if you will, is to identify in consultation appropriate mitigation strategies for addressing the loss of that cultural patrimony that's set to be destroyed. And what those mitigation strategies look like, things get very convoluted and dangerous there. And it's another opportunity to divide and conquer. You know, maybe everybody has an idea. Do we want a museum? Do we want a medical center? You know, that sort of thing. Do we want a historical highway marker? Yeah, I find that I love our historical highway markers, and everyone should. We have the oldest of its kind in the country. They're iconic, and they've been expanded profoundly in talking about, you know, the diversity, demographic diversity and history of the Commonwealth. But often I find that they ring of something that used to be there. It is not appropriate mitigation by any means to make a sign with limited characters and stick it in the ground while you destroy the thing that the sign is referencing. This is not preservation. It's not mitigation. But, you know, these are put on a pinnacle, and maybe they should be, but it's not the end of the process. Yes, get the sign, go for the sign, but that should fuel, you know, that should be a platform for drawing attention to the historic significance, not an answer to the question. You know, it's begging more questions. Okay, well, if this is so important, then is there another way that we can do this?
Thank you so much, Tim, for this wonderful discussion. And I don't see any other questions in the chat. But we've run slightly over time and want to apologize again for some of the technical difficulties, but I think this was a really rich conversation. I would encourage everyone to please stay tuned for the post of this recorded event on our YouTube channel in case you missed some of the details and some of the resources that were shared during the discussion. But wanted to thank you, Tim, once again. It's really nice to meet you finally. And Naya, thank you so much for moderating the discussion. And so I think without further ado, we're going to go ahead and close out this discussion, and we wish everyone a wonderful weekend.